Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be, and welcome to a science post. It's a scientific commentary, more or less, called Ye of Little Faith. I'm not sure that I understand is the worst criticism a high-ranking person can dole out in the world of physics. Given the abstract strangeness and counterintuitive nature of some of the central tenets of modern physics, such a criticism often carries a heavy weight of irony. I'm not sure that I understand is something that a professor is allowed to say to a student, while students are not allowed to admit that they don't understand something, lest their grades suffer. The student must be the good little parrot and recite the silly rules. Whether or not the student believes the rules is largely a question of temperament. Some of the examples of concepts that physics students are expected to accept on faith include: despite the fact that this result conflicts with basic notions of common sense, I assure you it is not a paradox. Even though we have never measured effect X, we must all believe in it because it is a consequence of a theory we all know and love. There are several ways to interpret the meaning of these equations, and some of them are simply preposterous, so we will just ignore them and pay attention to the ones that seem to make sense. These results should not be interpreted objectively as a real physical motion. These properties exist only in an abstract sense. These two effects are measured in the same way and are associated with the same basic motion within a given object, but I assure you that they describe very different intrinsic properties of the object. Would any of these statements be acceptable in any other field of study? Religion? I thought that what made science different from religion was its insistence on reproducibility. What went wrong? We have all probably read about the crisis of reproducibility within the field of psychology, and many of us from other disciplines reacted to this with a sense that such a crisis is unique to the soft sciences, where interpretations are much more flexible. Hard sciences like physics are immune to such a problem because everything is based on hard numbers and measurements. Hard numbers don't lie, and the number of possible interpretations is far more constrained in a physical system compared to the complex environment of a human mind. When I decided to study physics in college 20 years ago, this was certainly my reasoning. But is this true? Could physics be suffering from an as yet undetected crisis of reproducibility? The areas of physics which are sometimes timidly criticized for lacking reproducibility typically use a large, expensive experimental apparatus of which there may only be one in existence in the entire world. Sometimes major claims are made based on these devices. For example, Bicep 2 claimed to have measured evidence that the universe inflated like a balloon at faster than the speed of light, and Opera claimed to have measured faster than light neutrinos. More than a year later, both of these measurements turned out to be wrong, as Bicep was only measuring dust, and opera was only measuring a loose fiber optic cable. In these instances, the error was detected and the scientific record was corrected. But how many other instances don't get this level of attention? Ice Cube, LHC, LIGO, and climate simulations are all members of the club of big science experiments, requiring large collaborations and large amounts of funding to sustain themselves. Ice Cube measures neutrinos. LHC measures high-energy collisions. LIGO measures gravitational waves. Climate simulations try to predict the future based on a complex model of the planet. Each of these experiments use unique data sets coming from unique measurements and unique algorithms which are hard for those without access to unique computing resources to reproduce. The uniqueness in all of these examples should be seen as a defect, yet not very many people seem that worried about it. What a killjoy is the natural reaction to such a condemning assessment. As science goes through its seasons of creation and destruction of ideas, one might argue that this is all natural and making such a criticism is unnecessary to accelerate the renewal of foundations and removal of spandrels. In any case, a few killjoys always try to reform seasonal activities. If you want to see the side which lost the battle for hearts and minds, check out the killjoy in an article published in 1968 about neutron stars and black holes. Then note the irony of who wrote the paper. Kip Thorne, before he won a Nobel Prize for selling his soul to the Gravitational Wave Observatory, he didn't believe that neutron stars were possible because he understood that they were a result of a misapplication of theory. He spent most of his career building a device to measure neutron star collisions when he knew that neutron stars didn't objectively exist. Another good case study in seasons of scientific inquiry involves a great mistake which has been playing out over the past 70 years. It is the marriage of Standard Model and Big Bang cosmology, abbreviated as LCDM physics. Criteria for a great mistake in physics are: the mistake held back the progress of science on a major issue for a long time, a lifetime or a century. If we look at LCDM physics, we see that it represents a linguistic break which has stood in the way of the use of a language that is more powerful, easier to understand, and more unifying. That's why I think that LCDM physics qualifies as a great mistake. Another criteria is the mistake stole part or all of the scientific life of one or more excellent scientists. LCDM physics has absorbed the efforts of tens of thousands of men and women over the past 70 years, since the Second World War. It has made no progress towards its stated goal of finding a simpler, more unified framework. In fact, it has made progress in the opposite direction. Significant progress. Another qualification as a great mistake in the history of science. is that the mistake was made deliberately by people who knew it was bad science to protect their careers, suppress competitors, or gain career advancement or money. LCDM physics was promoted because it excluded those who had not been educated in US-supported institutes. A researcher's use of the framework guaranteed ample funding from US government sources. This strategy was executed at the expense of the development of clear, cogent scientific models. Instead, opaque, overly complex semantics were promoted. This is yet another reason that it qualifies as a great mistake in the history of science. Another criteria for a great mistake is a substantial portion of the scientific community promoted the mistake or suppressed the truth for a number of years. LCDM physics has become so entrenched at the graduate level that many physics students are unaware that other frameworks exist. It has become entrenched in the popular imagination through popular science literature, to the point where if I go on a forum like Reddit and talk about the subtleties of and nuances of interpretation of LCDM physics, I get called fake news and banned from their forums by millennials who've been educated to think that the physics establishment has the one true story of everything. So that's another criteria for a great mistake in the history of science. And the last one I will mention is that the mistake caused substantial damage to society in terms of scientific progress, health, morality, or prosperity. LCDM physics has absorbed tens of billions of dollars in research funds, which could have been used for more productive purposes. The public was given the impression that physics is more mysterious and complex than it really is, and this was a fraud that will do lasting damage to the cause of increasing human knowledge. Perhaps there are those who would see my criticism as a betrayal of a scientific institution supported by the US government, and therefore as an unpatriotic act. But I see it as the duty of a citizen to speak out when the truth is either deliberately or accidentally obscured through government financial incentives. I doubt that politicians are even aware of what the physicists have been up to for the last 70 years. They were served the same pop science nonsense as the rest of us. It took me 20 years to figure out that the emperors of physics have no clothes. How did this mess happen? Methinks some nuclear engineers got spooked by the mess they made and decided to make an even bigger mess to hide the original mess. I think physicists noticed that when they made things sound more mysterious, they were able to secure more funding for their research. The rest is history. Of course, if this was just an innocent mistake, there is no fraud. However, I see the following text from a recent Nobel laureate as evidence that top physicists know that they are using deliberately obfuscating language, but they just don't care. From a book called Black Holes and Time Warps, Einstein's Outrageous Legacy by Kip Thorne, written in 1994, he writes, "Is space-time really curved? Isn't it conceivable that space-time is actually flat, but the clocks and rulers with which we measure it, and which we regard as perfect in the sense of box 1-1, are actually rubbery? Might not even the most perfect clocks slow down or speed up, and the most perfect of rulers shrink or expand as we move them from point to point and change their orientations? What could possibly make the ruler shrink when its orientation changes? Gravity, of course. What is the real, genuine truth? Is space-time really flat, as the above paragraphs suggest, or is it really curved? To a physicist like me, this is an uninteresting question because it has no physical consequences. Both viewpoints, curved space-time and flat, give precisely the same predictions for any measurements performed with perfect rulers and clocks. And also, it turns out, the same predictions for any measurements performed with any kind of physical apparatus whatsoever. Which viewpoint tells the real truth is irrelevant for experiments. It's a matter for philosophers to debate, not physicists. Moreover, physicists can and do use the two viewpoints interchangeably when trying to deduce the predictions of general relativity. The flat space-time paradigm's laws of physics can be derived mathematically from the curved space-time paradigm's laws, and conversely. This means that the two sets of laws are different mathematical representations of the same physical phenomena, in somewhat the same sense as 0.001 and 1/1000 are different mathematical representations of the same number. However, the mathematical formulas for the laws look very different in the two representations, and the pictures and exemplars that accompany the two sets of laws look very different. Since the laws that underlie the two paradigms are mathematically equivalent, we can be sure that when the same physical situation is analyzed using both paradigms, the predictions for the results of the experiments will be identically the same. We thus are free to use the paradigm that best suits us in any given situation. This freedom carries power. End quote. I think that this freedom has carried the power to confuse students, both deliberately and accidentally. If your students are confused, they will continue to work hard and spend more money to understand the mystery. This is fraud, and people like Kip Thorne, who knowingly took part in that system, are guilty of perpetuating a fraud on those who fund physics research, people like you and me. I haven't read John Horgan's book, The End of Science, but from what I've read in his blog, he has an attitude that is similar to mine. Academia is defined by closed communities that only cite within their bounds. And within those closed communities, you find competing research groups that deliberately ignore one another in their citations. Not only does this make the language used in the communities stilted and opaque with jargon and acronyms, it leads to research going in circles, swirling off from the main current of progress in large, stagnant eddies. After several years of scientific work, I started to notice that researchers mainly cited people they had personally seen at a conference, and many of the ideas they thought they had just invented had already been written about by researchers from the 1960s or through the 1990s, the pre-internet era. But nobody ever pointed this out to them because there was a sense that everything reported had to be positive. Anything which was directly critical was socially unacceptable, probably because of the funding agencies. This is a hallmark of zero progress. Some researchers make the distinction that journals are okay while conference proceedings are bad, since they tend to be composed of student work or status reports or on incomplete projects. But I actually have the opposite opinion. The conferences aren't too bad, but the journals are terrible because they tend to highlight research that is knowingly or more often unknowingly lifted from someone unknown and which often hides errors to gain the boost that a journal publication provides to a person or group's reputation and funding. The more of an incentive there is the bigger the incentive is, the bigger the incentive to cheat is. Yeah. Due to the competition surrounding journal publications and the funding implications of a publication, the incentives to lie and distort are simply too great. I don't mean that all journal publications are lies, I just mean that the incentives to mislead are strong. As an expert in something, I could identify where a researcher from my field was hiding something ugly about an experiment, but nobody else could detect it. This situation makes papers act as fuel for zombie ideas that should have died a long time ago. There are no zombie slayers in existence, because if you write something that is critical of another research group, you risk being permanently ostracized for jeopardizing the funding flow to the community. After I stepped out of my field and looked at the larger picture, I saw that some of the biggest, most famous experiments in science were committing the same sorts of crimes I'd seen on a smaller scale. They were overselling what they had really learned, downplaying error sources, and thereby stretching the truth. When you do science for money, status, and power instead of for truth, the distorting effects of those incentives cause you to delude yourself into believing in weak experimental evidence. A good scientist has skepticism as his or her guide, and without it we are very good at tricking ourselves into believing that coincidences represent repeatable events. So if I take an overview, you would say that too much money is poison for science. And we've really been living in some boom times for scientific funding. There are 1,000 times more physicists in existence compared to when Albert Einstein was alive, when he was practicing. So, 1,000 times. People think that pseudoscience only consists of things like homeopathy, chronology, and astrology, but it is much more widespread than that. And lots of people understand that, but the people who defend science are often deliberately defensive about these matters. In medicine, there are many procedures that come into fashion based on weak evidence. Medications, heart operations, spinal operations, knee operations, ear tubes for children, labor complications, etc. And then, with further study, we learn that the patient was better off left alone. In psychology, you've probably read about their reproducibility crisis, but I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, in that all of our scientific research has those sorts of flaws. In biology and chemistry, a website called Retraction Watch has become popular as a gathering point for information about researchers who have a tendency to fabricate data or commit other scientific crimes. In economics and other soft sciences, the only valid scientific method is to make a prediction that changing A will cause B to change and then test it. But that is not possible in economics. It is easy to fit curves to historical data, but not easy to prove that those curves have predictive power. There are too many black swans and no closed systems. Climate science. I am a liberal, but I am appalled by how much politics distorts the scientific case. So, in physics, you've got the theoretical aspects where people make theories that can never be tested, and that makes them philosophy, not science, but Because many of these students haven't been educated in the philosophy of science, they aren't aware that what they're doing is not scientific. Pseudoscience is anything that pretends to uphold the standards of the scientific method but falls short, and much of what we think is true today has been produced through methods that fall short of scientific standards. And that makes it all pseudoscience. This is all normal, right? We believed in phlogiston for hundreds of years before understanding that it didn't exist. And there will be something that we believe in today that turns out to be wrong. But just being wrong doesn't make something pseudoscience. Pseudoscience is when you delude yourself with weak evidence, and when money and power are at stake. This is guaranteed to happen. I think that the solution is to reduce the competitive atmosphere and reduce the incentives. Competition fails to produce research of good quality when the number of competitors is limited to just a few large groups with nothing trickling down to the smaller, newer groups. This is what tends to happen in scientific communities, in capitalist economies, emotional economies, and perhaps also in online communities. When you have only a small number of groups studying a topic, there are fewer cross-checks and therefore a higher likelihood of scientists tricking themselves into believing weak data. This leads to groupthink and pseudoscience. If the groups get their funding from different sources, government institutions, the groupthink effect can be made worse because there is little incentive for a group from one country to point out the errors in another country's research. There is an attitude of, if you don't mess up my funding, I won't mess up yours. They can each claim that their research is valid just because someone in another country studies the same thing, as in, they run the same scam. A laissez-faire economic system would rely on bankruptcy to remove the worst research groups, but the elders of the scientific community don't let each other go bankrupt. With a steady stream of government funding at stake and ties going back to their school days, they watch each other's backs. Perhaps a recession or temporary funding reduction would provide a cleansing, reorganizing effect, as it is known to do in the economy. But a recession wouldn't correct the structural income inequality problem. Income inequality has been reduced by large wars in the past, but war would be highly destructive of existing institutions. I would hope that a scientific war would not play out like the Spanish Inquisition, although that is a very fun topic for a novel I'm working on. In a system reminiscent of progressive taxation, funding agencies set aside a certain amount of money to dole out to younger researchers. But what the funding agencies don't always consider is that these young researchers are far from independent. They rely on older, more powerful people or institutions to support their grant requests. This serves as another mechanism of groupthink enforcement. Thinking of science as an economic system, the inheritance tax should remove bad ideas from circulation, as the older researchers retire and their worst ideas retire with them. The next generation can read their work and decide on what looks legitimate, based on the merits of what is written down. But in the age of big science, this doesn't happen anymore at an institutional level. One researcher retires and gives his power to the person who takes his place, thereby preserving the distribution of power given to various ideas. This can crystallize dead-end ideas within a large institution. The perpetuation of an idea's power, despite weak evidence, also draws from the influence of self-citation. A large group can produce a mountain of self-referential material, and there is no incentive for them to cite those outside of their group, because the outsiders often represent a threat to their funding supply and reputation. This leads to a massive eddy of self-citation that swirls off from the main current of progress. An eddy is a problem because that means that those caught up in it are not influencing anyone, and no one is influencing them. Old ideas are forgotten and may be rediscovered again and again by research groups that are caught up in such a myopic pattern. These are serious structural issues because we spend a substantial fraction of our GDP on science. In the US, you have $13 billion in military technology research, $7 billion National Science Foundation that goes to universities mostly, $26 billion Department of Energy budget, $31 billion National Health Institute, $18 billion NASA budget, $10 billion Department of Commerce, NOAA, that's NOAA, NIST, Oceans, Forestry, and however many other billion on research for other areas in education research, economics and such, psychology. The grand total must be more than 100 billion. And this doesn't take into account the cost of educating scientists and science educators in the university system, which would surely add 100 billion more. So if we want non-corporate science to consist of internet educations and backyard experiments, we could save $200 billion per year. For each adult, this amounts to 1,000 taxpayer dollars per year spent on science, or 2% of the per-person GDP. In my calculations, I must have missed a significant funding source, probably a military dark budget, because, or maybe, some sort of space budget probably, because the Wikipedia says that not 2% of the per-person GDP is spent on science, but 2.7%. If I compare this to research spending by the top 15 companies, I see about 150 billion listed in their budgets as R&D, not including the infrastructure investments necessary to support that research. This makes the private sector research contribution a bit larger than the public sector contribution. But since knowledge is power, cutting the federal research budget would result in a reduction of federal power. Cash-rich companies would subsequently become more powerful as they take possession of secrets that give them an advantage, and they would not necessarily have any loyalty to a given country. They could take that information to the highest bidder. One such company is Amazon, with 600,000 employees and servers that contain most of the data held by the CIA. And given their political infiltration of the Defense Department, they were aiming to get access to all of the Defense Department data as well. Amazon is led by a man who dreams of helping humanity colonize space, and he believes in this mission with a passion that does concern me, since some of the worst monsters in history committed atrocities because they were passionate about an ideal. You think of Hitler wanting to Germanize Europe. Think of Mao's Great Leap Forward, which caused people to melt down their farming equipment to produce steel quotas. Think of Stalin's political purges or Pol Pot's dream of remaking society in an ideal image. I mean, I'm sure Jeff Bezos is not Pol Pot. At least I hope not. What I know about him is that he believes in the benefit of a relentless, brutal workplace culture, which places the value of progress far above happiness and which has a warped view of what meritocracy means, in my opinion. And I think it arranges this work-life balance to encourage men to, the top, to work themselves too hard. And because, the top two echelons of his organization are made up entirely of men. And in an organization that values work at all costs, this is not a surprising result. Women are not willing to kill themselves for status in the same way that men are. And we may think that this is something we can't control, that men are just built that way, but we could change corporate culture so that the lure of status is not so attractive to men, so that they don't focus on it, or they look for status elsewhere outside of the workplace rather than competing solely within the workplace, which I think produces an unhealthy environment. I think organizations with a hyper-competitive hierarchical structure are evil because providing incentives for men to work themselves to death is cruel. I mean, I saw this within the science lab I worked at. The men may think that they are having fun up until the moment that they drop dead of a heart attack at age 50 or 60. They may think that they are working to make a better future for everyone as they medicate themselves into a zombie-like state to maintain productivity, only to wake up decades later paralyzed in a nursing home at age 65. This is serious. This sort of self-abuse doesn't just happen at the top of the corporate ladder, although the ones who have climbed to the top have most certainly been very hard on themselves. There are even stories of men dropping dead in Amazon's warehouses, after running themselves ragged as they respond to commands from an automated manager. Perhaps I seem too emotional about these issues, but I've seen systems like this kill or maim men in my family. Amazon is just one example of many. The medical industry, the scientific research industry, and IT have all crushed converts, destroyed families, and deposited casualties in homeless encampments. That is why I am creating this blog and why I wrote my novels. I wanted to cast a spell that may someday produce the sort of kinder, gentler world that I hope to see, where we are aware of what the institutions we build are doing to people, that we don't build psychopathic institutions. I mean, the individuals within the institution might all be very good people, but it's possible for the structure of the institution to be evil and have evil incentives. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe there's something I simply do not understand about human nature, or I do not wish to see. Maybe not. I think we can do better. And one of the ideas I had about this was that whenever women enter a career path or a level of the hierarchy, that lowers the value, the status of that job. It makes it less attractive to men. So one possible way to remove the incentive for men to work themselves to death, to climb to the top of some boys' club, is to reduce the value of those hierarchies. If you put women in them, then the men don't see it as valuable anymore. So sitting on the board shouldn't be a great honor. It should be just something you have to do. You put half of the people on the board are now women, and maybe then people aren't going to see it as such a major status thing. Yeah. So I would hope that we don't have a situation where women are working full-time and raising kids full-time and men are working themselves 24 hours a day. We need to scale everybody back and consume less so that we get off of this accelerating treadmill of consumption. So, in conclusion, I appreciate the irony of posting a link to the book I am selling on Amazon in a post that criticizes Amazon's zeal for progress. I just think we can do better. And I've lived long enough to see men crushed under the wheel of progress, and I don't want to see more people crushed. I would thank you for watching this post and encourage you to tune into the next one.